Well, hi there. So in this video is the last lecture of Unit 8, woohoo, in which we're going to learn about the loanable funds market. So this is the market where people go to borrow money and where people go to lend money to each other. So let's get started. Okay, the first part up here just tells you what this type of market is. I just told you it's the market for money being lent and borrowed. And the key here is we're going to use the real interest rate for the price. That's because borrowers and lenders care about the real interest rate that's being paid rather than just the nominal interest rate. Now, there's a whole lot of information up here about the supply of loanable funds and the demand for loanable funds. And I do want to kind of talk briefly about it. The sources of supply are savers, right? Because all savers are lenders. And so one thing that you can do to help yourself remember with this is that this is not the supply of all the money in an economy. This is the supply of money that's going to be lent out. And so the more that people actually put money into banks, the more that gets lent out. That's a really fundamentally important concept. Shows up a lot. It's key. It's called the savings investment identity. And it's really just that every dollar that we put into the financial markets ends up getting transformed somewhere else, coming back out as borrowed money, as money that will finance new projects, right? Whether that's new consumption projects, new investment spending, or government spending of some kind. Those dollars don't just get locked into a bank and then disappear. Now, so the central banks can also create more of this money. They can obviously create money that could be lent out. But in general, we would say that the supply of loanable funds is made up of private individuals like you and I deciding to save our money. You could also say that it's made up of what's called national savings, government, right? Choosing not to run a deficit, for example, running a surplus would be an example of national savings. So if the government ran a surplus, we would actually say that that would increase the supply in some ways as well. Now, upward sloping, that's because basically we will be induced to supply more funds when the interest rate is higher. So households literally will sock away more cash as the real interest rate rises because they'll earn a greater rate of return. So that one's hopefully not too bad. It's a standard supply curve. You're willing to produce more of something in response to a higher price of it. Now, there are some shifters, right? Why people decide to lend or save. That would affect the overall amount of savings. And obvious ones are when the central bank creates more money. So if the central bank creates more money, there's by definition more money that could be lent out. So that one's pretty obvious, I think, when they create excess reserves. But the other one is really about private savings rates. And there's a few factors that affect private savings rates. The big one is inflation. If there's high inflation, that can erode people's savings and it can reduce the supply of loanable funds. If there's low inflation, then people will have more savings because they don't need their money for themselves, and that can increase the supply of loanable funds. This one here is a little tricky. It's called international capital flows, but it really is just the foreign savings. And we would say that in countries with really high real interest rates or that are considered really safe from by other investors, like a good, reliable place to invest your money, they will attract capital from around the world. So people from other countries can move their money into your loanable funds market for your economy. So you might have a US loanable funds market and you might have a Canadian loanable funds market. And the Canadians could move their money into the US loanable funds market, in which case there's a greater supply of loanable funds in the US loanable funds market. On the other hand, in a country with low real interest rates, that's going to cause people to say, no, I don't really want to put my money in that country, and money will flow out. There will be outflows, is what we call them. Money flows out. And those outflows would mean the supply of loanable funds is decreasing. So it's essentially that there could be different real interest rates in different countries, and that can induce the movement of international capital, financial capital, money. Now, the demand side is made up of people who want to borrow money. And there are a handful of groups that want to borrow money in an economy, and they are really the shifters of the demand for loanable funds. Before we get to them, let me kind of talk briefly about this downward slope. There is a downward slope because at very high real interest rates, people don't want to borrow very much. And at very low interest rates, they do want to borrow more. And the reason why they do that is that very often firms will compare the real interest rate to the rate of return on a project. They'll look at it and they'll say, do we want to expand our business? Well, we think we might earn, say, 10% on our expansion, right, on our investment. And if that's above what the rate of interest is, then it's worth it for them to actually do this project. But if they think that maybe they'll only earn 2 or 3% of a rate of return, not very much return on their investment, right? That's what ROI, return on investment, means. If you're not going to earn much return on investment, then you're not going to spend more than that on borrowing the money. And so very often what happens is at high interest rates, not very many projects make sense. So not much borrowing happens. at low interest rates, lots of projects make financial sense to do. Maybe we'll build this apartment building, we'll expand this store, we'll build this new strip mall, all these things, right, that might make sense when interest rates are very low. And in which case, then you borrow the money and those things happen. So there's an inverse relationship between the quantity demanded of borrowed money and the real interest rate. Now, the shifters of money demand, of loanable funds demand, are really about what could cause businesses, consumers, and the government to borrow more or borrow less. And the three easy ones are business and consumer confidence, right? If businesses and consumers are more confident, they're going to go and borrow money and expand and spend more money, right? So confidence can affect the demand for loanable funds. Inflation can also affect the demand for loanable funds. And you'll notice that it's on both sides. Just pick one, right? So I see here inflation and inflation, only one side. Inflation, just pick one. Pick one is what I'll kind of put here. So like if you get a question that says higher inflation has resulted, show that in the loanable funds market. It doesn't matter whether you show it as a decrease in supply or an increase in demand, you'll end up with the same result in terms of the interest rate, which is really what we care about in the loanable funds market. And so with higher inflation, you're going to need more money because literally you need more money to buy the things that you wanted to buy. So it would lead to more borrowing and thus an increase in the demand for loanable funds. The last one, and this is by far probably the most common one, this one's key, super important, is government borrowing. Government borrowing makes up a big part of the demand for loanable funds because when they borrow more, there's a more demand for loanable funds. And so this one's really, really important. It's going to show up often, shows up a lot. It shows up a lot. So I'm just going to put that one in there. Let's draw this and we'll kind of see what it looks like. I, and then we're going to put sub R, right? Really important, right? I sub R, key detail. Got to have that little R. That distinguishes this market from the money market. Then we're going to have a just plain old Jane supply and demand graph. Looks like that. You can call it SLF and DLF if you want. Sometimes it's helpful to remember these are the borrowers, right? And these are the savers or the lenders, if you want to say, because the savers and lenders are the same thing. And so that's really what this market just kind of looks like. It's just a plain supply and demand graph. Now, what would it look like if there's an increase in government borrowing? Well, you'd have QIR, right? And supply, and then we'll just have an increase in demand. So if the government decides to borrow more money, there would be higher real interest rates. So we're going to put I prime and I1 and Q prime or Q star and Q1. So there would be more quantity of borrowing at a higher real interest rate. Now, thinking about the crowding out, this would be the last thing because it often ties into this very question. If government borrowing increases real interest rates, we can very often say, therefore, investment will go down, right? So kind of thinking about increasing real interest rates, that's coming from this picture. Investment goes down, therefore, there's less capital. Therefore, there's lower productivity in the long run. And hopefully you see where I'm going with this. Therefore, there's lower long-run growth. And so very often we can make this connection between government borrowing and slowing down economic growth, especially in closed economies. And we'll come back in Unit 9 and talk about what I mean by closed economies in this context. But very often there's kind of that trade-off, right? In the immediate moment of trying to fix a recession, your government might borrow a lot of money. And when they're trying to borrow that money to fix the recession, what it's going to do is possibly slow down economic growth rates because of a slower rate of capital formation, right? Because we're not going to be buying basically as much tools, equipment, and machinery, and that'll slow down productivity growth and slow down economic growth. Hopefully this helped you kind of thinking about the loanable funds market as the last market for money. I'll see you next time.